let's go for it. Yeah. I'm sure that there'll be another 50 people walking in a moment. Hello, good evening, ladies and gents. If you are watching with us live, or maybe watching at a later date, welcome to We Need to Talk About Sunday. Thanks for those people who have joined us in the room as well. I expect and hope for some very inspiring questions to throw this way to Gareth and John. We have two guests with us today, and Jason is doing all of the work to help us stream this live from the church today. So he's manning the desk right there, and we wish him well because he's soldiering on today, having got over some illness. So it's a very special event today because we're going to be talking about Climate Sunday and more generally the climate crisis that we're facing. And Gareth, you gave us a message not last Sunday but the Sunday before on Climate Sunday. And really we invite you to kind of have some questions as well. So if you have any thoughts at any point, I've come prepared, but I'm expecting some extra thought-provoking ideas that we can send this way. So if you want to email, you can email Jason at romseymethodist.church, and he will relay them via WhatsApp to me. Or we have a Slido up on there, so if you want to use the QR code, you can send some questions in there, and again, Jason will relay them to me as well. Gareth, John, welcome.
Good to be here.
Can we start with Gareth? Climate Sunday. Can you give us, in a nutshell, what do we need? Why do we need Climate Sunday?
Well, I approach it as a preacher from a theological point of view. So for me, my reading of Scripture, it begins with a story of creation, and at the end of that, God says this is good. In fact, at one point, it's very good. Mm-hmm. And then the Bible ends with a garden again. And we're in the book of Revelation, and in the book of Revelation where it's a garden, everything is good again. Mm-hmm. The issue is the bit in the middle, where for various reasons people choose to go their own way, they create chaos in their wake, and the result of that chaos is in part that the planet suffers. Mm. So for me it's a theological thing that if we're going to honor God and God's creation, we need to be people who take seriously the state of the planet and do our bit. Mm, mm.
And John, you've been invited here as our scientist man. I'm not a scientist. I know, Gareth, you said that you're not a scientist. Can you give us, in a nutshell, effectively, what is the biggest issue that we face with the climate nowadays?
Well, the vast majority is the emission of fossil fuels, and the vast majority of that is carbon dioxide. Methane itself is also a fossil fuel, and that's the second largest contributor to global warming. I found out from a science meeting, I guess it was in 2010, I went to one which was organized by the Royal Society, and saw a slide which showed at that point in time, this was 2010, that we'd already, in our history, added half as much carbon into the atmosphere as we dare to keep below 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise. We now know that 2 degrees should really be better, 1.5 as a target. Mm-hmm. So that meant that target that we had of having 500 million tons of carbon still left has been eroded away. So what we're left with now is, if you look at graphs of the rise in emissions like this, to get to a decent 0 point, you either used to have to do that, but now you have to do that in about 10 years' time. You'll have to drop almost vertically in the scale. So the urgency is apparent.
And this is human impact rather than any other sort of factor?
Yes, I mean, the modelling is really remarkably good these days. And it seems clear, I would say for nearly 30 years, 25 years at least, that the deviation from other sources, which is a volcano or changes in solar emissions, are not in line with what is being observed. It was true earlier in the previous century that in fact natural sources were dominating, but certainly since the 1980s that's not been the case.
So we've been talking about climate crisis for a long time now, multiple years. Why is it that we still seem to be stuck with inaction? Why, having been speaking about climate crisis for so long, has there been nothing to kind of change the fact that it's this impending doom?
I think it's not just impending doom, it's a case of designing changes in the way humanity works, really. There are various scenarios which are given certain labels, and the end of the label is how much warming they will actually give to a square meter. Mm-hmm. And the lowest versions of these require a lot of change, but they would keep us within 1.5 degrees. In fact, it would then fall back towards neutrality. The largest one, which is generally modelled, would take us towards a temperature rise, which is perhaps 7-8 degrees. And now, to put this in context, the difference in global temperature between what we are used to and an ice age was about 7 degrees.
Right.
So that's the kind of difference that you're looking for. Why are we still talking about this? Firstly, you had a lot of debate, a lot of people that would deny this, just as people deny that coronavirus existed or vaccines can work. Mm-hmm. There's a similar sort of mindset which said, look, I cannot believe this. Some say God would not let this happen. God didn't put this in the Bible, but there are other ways of interpreting the Bible that I'm sure would be contrary to that. The next phase has been really that people have got past denial and gone to indifference. They've gone to really to delaying anything. I don't need to do anything now. It's not my problem. I can't do very much. And so it really is a case of whether people have something which really clicks with them. And that I think is the big effect, really. For me, it was a graph, but I'm weird. But the graph told me the circumstance in which I could see that we were heading towards.
Sure. Yeah.
I think the thing that made me sit up and take notice was some years ago now when I worked in London, I was in a conversation with a mission partner who had returned from the Pacific Islands. And I really knew that there were issues with global warming, but I didn't really understand what any of that meant. I needed something to make it concrete. And this mission partner told us of the community where she'd been, where already the seas had risen significant numbers of feet, which meant that people had to move from their own homelands. And the way that it brought home to me was that it wasn't just that they'd had to move house, which is something that we often do in this kind of culture, but the land that they moved from had been their generational land. It had been where their ancestors were born and died. And they could go back 6 and 7 generations of people who had lived and died there. So their identity was rooted in that patch of land where they lived. And to simply be told by the government, you've got to move, it meant for them that they were saying goodbye and they were negating their entire family story and their tribal history. And for some people, that was just too much. They couldn't cope with that. So that made me suddenly realize that what I thought was a scientific problem and ought to be left to scientists to sort out was actually my problem. And then when I came here, 6 years ago as the minister, and we began conversations around eco-church, that then began to crystallize it for me in a way that actually we could do something about it. It might not change the whole world, but we change the bit where we are.
I think we're probably going to talk about this more throughout the evening, but I wonder whether, John, you've just picked up on this idea, this attitude of avoidance, of duty, of care, of responsibility. And I just wonder, why do you think that we have that attitude of, why do you think that this has been sort of shrugged off? And you said indifference, John. Why do you think that is? And what can we do to change that? Either of you.
Well, it's a million different answers to different people. Some people particularly are concerned, rightly so, about loss of habitat, the degradation of biodiversity, and the effect that has on the beautiful things they see. And seeing that attacked is something which really can influence them very, very greatly. Often it's seeing that your lifestyle is affected. You may just determine that you don't really want to stop burning a garden fire, even though garden fires are very good at carcinogens and particles which these days could also carry viruses. So there are lots of things which you can change slightly in your lifestyle, but people don't particularly want to do it. They don't see it's important. And there's still, driving through Wellow a couple of weeks ago, still managed to find cans which have been thrown out of car windows, which seems to be kind of crazy for one reason is litter, but also for a chemist, it's a complete waste of the energy required to make an aluminium can. And that offends me as a chemist.
Gareth, what do you think about the attitude, that's sort of the attitude of avoidance and indifference?
I think the attitude is actually completely understandable because most of us have been raised in an age when to consume was a really good thing. And we've always talked about, built-in obsolescence. Somebody has a fridge that's run for 50 years, but when that dies, you have to buy a new one, which might last you 6, 10 at the most. So I think we've grown up with that sense of things do fail and have to be replaced. And when they're replaced, you get somebody to take it away. And you can say, that's not my responsibility anymore because it's out of my house, out of my care. And so I think part of it is that. So the indifference is around, I gave somebody else the responsibility. Now, I think, I'm ashamed at that, but I'm also really grateful that our young people have actually stood up. My grandchildren's default position is to recycle, is to find appropriate ways of not throwing stuff away for the sake of it. I'm excited by young entrepreneurs who set up clothes exchange bureaus online, things like Vinted. I'm impressed by young Christians who want to march the whole length of Britain to tell the story of how this is unfair and unjust and needs changing. So I think indifference is being challenged. The test now is to help people understand what they need to do beyond that indifference.
So from a scientific point of view, John, are we too late? Have we missed the opportunity to change our attitudes, to not be indifferent, to make action? Is it possible to make significant change? And if so, and this can be to both of you, how can we help people not be pessimistic in that thought and be optimistic and be hopeful in that way?
Certainly, I think I've been living over the last couple of years really concerned with this issue of hope and trying to put out the message in a way which has positivity. People do not want to change for a negative reason. They want to change because they can understand that something they do is right. Really, I think it is a case of making sure you're in line with people's best interests, with their best values. I was listening to a podcast tonight, just before coming out, and there was a discussion really it's not a case of wanting people to lead them. People don't want to be led, and it's not the way. It should be really, it's a partnership. When people are working together, then you can spill off from your own scale. You're becoming a larger scale, and you can make a significant difference. The emphasis is clear that we have not lost everything. We're heading down a bad track. It's reckoned that all the promises in so far from the mitigations that governments have offered will actually cause a reduction in emissions of 1%. It's reckoning that you'd probably need that to be multiplied by a factor of about 45 to be what we actually need. So it's a case of trying to convert civic society as much as anything to influence governments that they feel they have no option but to follow what is a proper sustainable route.
And so, Gareth, as Christians, are we positive enough to bring about change, or is it more effective to profess doom and gloom on billboards at the street corners?
Yeah. I mean, I'm optimistic. I think I'm optimistic by nature, so I would try to look at the positive of how people can make a difference. Mm-hmm. I was very struck, and I think this is something that provokes people to action, looking at the story of the Young Christian Climate Network, the folk who've been walking from Cornwall to Glasgow ahead of COP26, and the prayer boats that they had made, not because of the prayer boats themselves, but because of the image that was behind it, which was of a storm and a big boat, which is the ark, kind of representative of let's rescue everybody. But underneath it were a whole range of smaller boats, and the legend that said we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And for me, that sense of hearing the story of the Pacific Islanders, trying to recognize that there are some parts of the world which, for reasons beyond their control, are incapable of making the difference, the changes we can make. That provokes me to say, how do I do something locally that challenges the narrative that actually it's too late and we just abandon hope? I don't think we ever abandon hope. I don't think God abandons us. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to look at ways of, as John puts it, making those small mitigations. And so I have to ask myself, what is it I'm wasting? What is it I am burning that I shouldn't be burning? What is it that I'm not paying attention to that I can do in my house and in my garden and with my neighbors that will just shake that narrative a little bit? So for me, it's really small steps done locally, but that have that global impact.
I really like that you mentioned about small changes, but the fact that they're also those small noticeable changes so that others may be able to see those changes and it might have an effect, an impact on them as well. And I thought that was a really nice message. And we've had a few questions come in on Slido, which is great. And one of them is, where could the greatest step change be made? I suppose just change be made for our community to stand up and help the environment. So we talked about small changes. What about the greatest change that we could make in our community?
Probably it is influencing government policy.
Yeah.
The issue really is that there are promises made by government and there are promises which may be delivered, and those two are not always in line. So in a sense, because of the scale of things, having something that influences fiscal policy. Mm-hmm. In this country we have the largest difference between the price of electricity and the price of gas in anywhere in Europe. Right. So that switch, a fiscal switch, which would take away from some resourcing from fossil fuels to renewable energy platforms, would make a big difference in the way things could be rolled out.
Can I ask you, from a quite a naive point of view, obviously we're bringing in a new change of electric vehicles and electrical, and out with petrol vehicles. And I say this is not a petrol head really, not knowing my stuff, but obviously we know that petrol is bad and electricity is better, but surely the fact that we're creating all of these extra new model cars and something's got to make them, factories or, these sorts of things, where's the balance with that?
You're right, the question is exactly the right one. There's something which is basically called the embodied energy of something that you make. Mm-hmm. And there was a study of this which was carried out about 12 years ago, particularly about our lifestyle in the UK. Mm-hmm. For example, your house stands there for a long time, mm-hmm. Let's say 100 years. It's made of bricks and mortar, stone, bits of wood. Generally, those are low carbon, low energy containing materials. Mm-hmm. Your car, on the other hand, doesn't have quite as much weight. It certainly doesn't have the size, but it has a lot of embedded energy in the materials themselves. Mm-hmm. And also it has a much lower lifetime. So on average, your new car would cost you more of your carbon footprint than your house would. Mm. What you put in your house is another matter, because that goes into the car territory. And the things that any of us contributes towards our carbon footprint are the two main things: our food and drink and what we buy. It's the stuff we buy and it's the stuff we consume, more than the energy than we use to heat our homes even.
I think it's easy nowadays to sort of feel like we're getting into the climate, sort of the war on climate change can become a bit of a fad. So much so that, people might go out and buy all these extra Tupperware boxes in order to make sure they've got Tupperware boxes when they go out, and they've said, oh, look, but I've made my lunch. I haven't bought an extra lunch or whatever. But that does mean that obviously they've gone out and bought a new product sort of thing. So
there's truth in that, and unfortunately organic cotton comes into that. There was a study in Denmark about comparing a plastic bag to do your shopping and an organic unorganic cotton material, and they reckoned that you'd have to use that bag 29,000 times to match the carbon imprint of a polyethylene bag. So yes, you have to be quite careful about avoiding fads, and it's not easy to know. We'll all make mistakes trying to do it, but I think I agree with Gareth. We try to find the steps that we can make, and there was a sense of the book which influenced me when I was a student was Situation Ethics. I feel like love is not just the attitude of love, but it's the attention to understanding it, so that you can express that Christian love in the most effective way.
It seems to me that the emphasis should be very much on shop sustainably, not just shop more new stuff.
Yes,
I think that's right, and I mean, my background is much more in terms of understanding maybe what God's asking of us by looking at Scripture. But even I'm aware that if I buy myself some new clothes, the amount of water and energy that's being used up to make those is a massive contributor. Now, I think I would say this perhaps, but I think we have to stop beating ourselves up over everything, and we have to say we have to live. And nobody's arguing that we should go around in rags. At some point, you need to buy some new clothes.
Sure.
But I think understanding the impact of that and what we can then do with the stuff that sits in our wardrobe and gets worn once and then just waits, I think those things are quite important.
Yeah.
I was really encouraged. The things that I find that encourage me, I watched a TV program, one of those programs about people looking for a new home, and they get taken somewhere, and this was based in Cornwall. And one of the little segments in the middle of the program was a company in Cornwall, Plastic Oceanic, who take waste from beaches and turn it into jewelry. And it is fantastic. It's absolutely gorgeous. And so I thought, I need to do something, having watched that, having been touched by it. So I bought Joy some jewelry from the company. And that's not massive. It's a little pendant made up of a little bit of compressed beach waste. But for me, that's the kind of stuff we can do that makes a difference. When I lived down in the West Country, Surfers Against Sewage began regular beach cleans. And some people said they were just bonkers. You know, it was just a gimmick. But actually, they would show you 35 bin bags full of stuff from one small portion of a beach. And you think, actually, that does make a difference. And young people get engaged with that, particularly children that love going and kind of beach combing. And so they were joining in. So they were then going to school and saying, look what we did on the Saturday. We cleaned this beach and we had all these bags of rubbish. And they're going to take those away and they're going to try and deal with them. And so the tide rolls a bit until people are actually beginning to think, why did I buy that? How do I shop well? How do I ensure that stuff doesn't get just thrown away? How do I enable recycling and reuse to take place? And for me, that's a Christian approach to life. I quoted in the sermon an American Wesleyan professor who had said about particularly the Methodist Church and the Wesleyan movement, that it's a movement marked by profound hope. And for me, that's where we have to start, is saying, I hope and I believe that with God's help and with action from human beings, we can make a difference and that the planet will notice and breathe a bit more easily.
You mentioned a very short phrase in your service a couple of weeks ago about climate justice, and I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about that, climate justice.
For me, it's what I've just been saying, really. It is that we own up to what I guess in Christian terms we'd call our sin. We own up to the fact that we have contributed to this as well. And that if that St. Paul, in writing to Romans, the Roman Church, talks about creation groaning as in the pains of childbirth. Now, that isn't directly groaning because the planet is struggling, but it is more about creation birthing something different. And that the groans of creation are the anticipation that there is something better to come, something new, something hopeful. And so for me, climate justice, particularly within the Christian context, is learning how to stand up and shout and who to shout to get change action. Learning the points at which I interact with that and turn injustice to justice. And as we've already said, some of that's really small. But if tens of thousands of us do something really small, then the climate begins to be more just. The injustice is clearly that when sea levels rise, when droughts are longer and hotter, that people who we will never meet die as a result of it. So for me, climate justice says, what do I do with my faith that enables my sister and brother in Saharan Africa to live? Not to live better, but just to live.
Hillary went to Mexico a couple of years ago as part of Methodist Women in Britain travels, and she met people who were at the borders with the United States, who come from many countries, African countries as well as South American countries, many of whom said that the reason they were moving was, in fact, that climate change had meant that their agricultural lifestyle was unattainable with the changes in climate in South America. So that's an example, strong example, like Gareth's, about the sea level rise, where people's lives have changed. They're desperate enough to take that awful journey just because of the circumstances they're in. One of the charities that the church works with is as climate stewards and supports this through carbon offsetting. And one of their activities is to fund sustainable by carbon offsetting, to set up sustainable communities, which is actually one of which is actually on that track in South Mexico, which would, in a sense, produce the reverse of desert formation in that area.
Do you think that carbon offsetting is sometimes used as an excuse to go and to keep your lifestyle as it is, sort of thing? You know, if you're going on a flight somewhere and you say, well, it's okay, but I've carbon offset it, does that mean that it's okay to go flying here, there, and everywhere? You know?
I think you've got to be very careful with the audit trail. In fact, I had this discussion with somebody else with exactly the same in a different venue at the weekend. We know the audit trail for this. This is a charity, a church-based charity, linked to Russia, who are the founding fathers of Eco Church, and also Wild Christian for the rewilding side of activities. And yes, for that point in time, we are doing something. It increases the cost to us to burn our oil, in this case, our gas. And so that gives you a reason to think again as to whether you should continue burning that fuel. It gives a budgetary reason that you might want to cut down on that. You might then want to change in the way you give money to that activity. But it gives some reasons for understanding a little bit more the true cost of what you're actually doing now.
Well, off the back of that, talking about burning fuel and burning money, there's another really interesting question that's on the Slido. How is it that space tourism is even allowed, given the carbon footprint?
I won't be volunteering for this.
Okay.
I think my budgetary constraints are quite severe. I mean, it's just madness. I'm sorry. It's.
Hang on, John. Don't hold back. Say what you think.
It's an ego trip, isn't it? It has okay. You can say the Apollo program is completely different. I think to this. This is just 15 seconds of cheap thrill, or very expensive thrill, I suspect. But then you have to work out what the regulatory pattern would be to stop it happening.
Where do we think we sit morally with space tourism, Gareth?
I think it's bonkers, and I agree with John. I think it is an ego trip, and it's interesting that it's basically people who can afford to play with anything and never count the cost. And for me, counting the cost is a significant element of this. So, yeah, it's madness.
Well, the Slido's still up, folks. So if there's any last-minute questions that want to come in, go for it. There's just one last little question that I have, unless anyone's in the room would like to shout out, and I'll relay it on the mic for people at home. But I've got quite a long question here, but I think if
it's long, it must be scientific, and so it must be John's.
No, it's about fellowship and community, so you're stuffed, I'm afraid, Gareth. I'm going to ask it. Okay, here it is. How can the church reconcile its desire for people to meet for worship and other fellowship activities, and as well as providing support services into the community, with the need to reduce our impact on the environment?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's interestingly for me one of the things that has been in my head for quite a while. The pandemic has been awful, and the impact of coronavirus and everything else has been devastating for many people. One of the things that it imposed on us was a lack of movement, certainly a lack of driving. And so for a period, for those who are watching, when I walk in from home to here, I walk down a canal path. And during the lockdowns, There were trout, there were ducks, there were swans, there were all sorts of really interesting bits of wildlife in the canal. The air was clearer. You could hear the birds singing because the planes weren't flying. And we moved worship online. Now, gradually, we're coming back into worshipping physically in the main. But I hope we've learned that there is the capacity for an element of fellowship online, and that we don't have to rush full pelt back to where we were before the pandemic. There are some things we long for. We long for community. We long to be a people who see each other, meet each other, can say, how are you? But I think within that, if we're going to be true to Scripture, and there's a bit in the Old Testament which says that our task as Christians is to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Now, the act justly bit has to impose on us different ways of being a community of faithful people. And some of that will be, I don't fly to a conference in Geneva. In fact, I've never flown to a conference in Geneva, but I would turn that down and say, actually, let's do that over the internet. I know that the Global Methodist and Uniting Church Women's Network didn't have a conference in a particular place. They were due to be in Sweden, but the whole conference met online and talked about climate change. I am part of an annual meeting that helps the Methodist Church work out people who are allowed to lead communion on our behalf in churches. And we made the decision during the lockdown that we would never meet physically again. We would always have that annual meeting online, which has small impact. So I don't travel up to Manchester by train. I don't stay in a hotel overnight. And neither do the other 8 people who are on that committee. So we have reduced the impact a bit. And so for me, I don't want to lose fellowship. Fellowship matters. And for some people who speak to nobody all week, fellowship is critical to their self-worth and to their mental health. So we need to continue to meet together. That's another scriptural thing. But I think we have to be wise about how we meet, when we meet, what the impact of that meeting is. And I think you can hold both of those together, maybe in a kind of creative tension. So we will still have church where we come into a space and worship together. We'll still meet for cake and coffee, as this church does twice a week. We will still have fellowship groups that meet in spaces, in houses, in church. But we will think very carefully about when it's appropriate to do some of that stuff online as a way of mitigating the issues.
I used to go to conferences, even not to Geneva, but I used to go to Geneva on the way to doing experiments in France. And after a while, I got to a situation where I would only go to a meeting if they would pay for me to go by train rather than fly.
Right.
Now, almost all scientific conferences are taking place on the internet. And getting somebody to come to your conference is so much easier if you don't have to pay their airfare and you don't have to spend half a week getting to somewhere. So it's an opportunity as well. In terms of what we've been doing in the church with regard to eco-church and explaining what we think is a good way of working and finding out from others, in-person meetings was what we used. So somehow we have to be creative in that as well, in a way which we found very difficult over the last year. It's very hard to have a green fair with lots of people gaggling around when you have to be at home. But somehow we have to find a way to get back to some of those aspects so we can have a conversation with local people about what they're doing and what we can learn from them and vice versa.
Just to sort of sum up, it just seems to me that obviously that there are lots of obviously small ways in which we can make some noticeable differences. Gareth, as you said a couple of weeks ago, it's really important those are noticeable changes to people. And you sort of keep bringing up the idea of keep questioning yourself why you're doing stuff, how you're doing stuff, when, where, keep asking yourself those questions, because by questioning those things, you're making sure that you're doing the best that you possibly can. And John, you keep mentioning that obviously the biggest change that we can make really is to make sure that governments get on this as well, and that we can make big changes in that way. Is there anything else that you think, other than what Jason said here, is there more that we can do than just separating our recycling, other than the things that I've maybe mentioned already?
Actually, I've been to a couple of churches visiting other eco-churches actually do that for difficult to recycling items. I'm very worried about cobalt.
Okay.
Why should anybody be worried about cobalt? Because cobalt is one of the major elements in the lithium-ion battery, and it's in short supply. And if you think about tungsten, I'm sure you think a lot about tungsten, there are wars over tungsten in the Congo. These are big items.
Sure, I don't really understand from a scientific point of view, but that's great.
The point is this, really. There is the option of trying to dig for these things under the sea.
Right.
Under the sea, on the seabed. And you just imagine what sea mining, and though this is being discussed at present. Uh-huh. On the other hand, we're appalling at collecting those materials, separating them out. When you've got the device, you have a much larger concentration of those elements in the device than you have wherever you're going to find it around the world. It's changing the approach, changing the highline attitude, which is saying, I can get another one. Saying this is a precious resource that we have and we must use it for God's purpose, really.
Right. Yeah.
I think I would want to end, in a sense, on a real note of hope.
Yeah.
Many years ago, living back home in Wales, I was heading out to speak at an evening meeting. And I drove up to the top of our valley, and I was heading off down into the next valley. And as I went down this road, this steep mountain road, ahead of me was the town where I was going. And it was just dusk. And gradually little pinpricks of light began to appear on the horizon and down in the town as people put their lights on in the house. And this doesn't happen to me often, but an absolute clear voice from God, I believe, said, see, every time one of those lights lights up, the darkness gets less. And for me, the action of the church and individual Christians is to find a way in which, when everybody else says everything is going to hell in a handcart, we can say, not entirely, because we believe in a God who believes in us. We believe in a God who ultimately will say, this is good again. And so that should spur us on to, yes, separate our recycling, to, yes, question the amount of travel we do, to, yes, ask questions of government. And I know here in this church, we are planning a conversation with our MP. I think Christians need to do that. They need to start writing more letters. They need to start badgering people who can make massive differences to say, we are watching you. We want you to do something about this. And for me, all of that is lighting lights that eventually will dispel the darkness.
At the same time, make sure you turn your lights off when you don't need them on. I think that feels like a sensible place to finish up. Thank you, gents, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Jason, for everything that he's done to keep us going. Anything to add, Jace, or you're happy? We're happy. We best... Gareth, would you like to pray to finish us off?
The prophet Micah challenges the people of God by quoting these words, "What shall I bring to God, the God of heaven, when I come to worship him?" And then goes on and talks about, should I bring burnt offerings? Well, in the context of what we've said, clearly not. Will the Lord be pleased if I bring him thousands of sheep, endless streams of olive oil? Shall I just go completely mad and even offer a child to cover up my sins? And then says those words that we quoted earlier. Actually, the call is to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. So, Father, as we end this conversation and then move out into our community to begin it again, we ask that you come by your Spirit and help us to focus on the changes we can make, to be people who shine lights for you in the darkness, who do reuse and recycle, who ask questions. Why do I live like this? And how do I live better? Inspire us, Father, as we move into the next phase of challenging the darkness. Amen.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the room. And thanks, folks, for watching online, live or at a later date. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.